It started with a voice I wasn't supposed to hear. I had just watched my neighbor Jason walk into his house, except Jason had been dead for 3 years. The funeral was still fresh in my memory, the way the rain fell that day, the somber silence that clung to the crowd. Yet there he was, alive, or at least appearing to be. His familiar form stepping into the front door as if nothing had ever changed. I blinked, hoping it was a trick, mirage. But when he turned the key and disappeared inside, I knew something had gone horribly wrong. What I saw that night was only the beginning. Something far darker, something twisted and unnatural was unraveling the world around me. And now I can't unsee it. The storm had arrived without warning, though I should have expected it. In this town, you learn to predict the weather by the way the wind shifted or how the clouds gathered overhead. But this storm felt different, heavier somehow, as though the sky itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and something else, something that wasn't quite right. I stood by the kitchen window, staring out at the drenched streets. The rain pelted the glass with a rhythm I had grown used to in these parts. It was an endless, monotonous beat that seemed to soak into my bones. My mug of cold coffee sat untouched on the counter, forgotten in the midst of the storm's heavy presence. The only other sound was the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance, vibrating through the walls like a warning. The world outside looked like a watercolor painting, blurred and indistinct, as if reality itself was bleeding into the mist. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, something just beyond my sight. I felt it more than I saw it. It was the kind of unsettling feeling you get when you sense a shadow hovering at the edge of your vision. But when you turn to look, there's nothing there. I took a deep breath, trying to clear the unease swirling in my chest. It was just a storm, just the weather, that's all. Nothing to be afraid of. But that's when I saw him. Jason, it was as though the world had paused. The rain itself halting mid-drop as I watched him. He was walking up his driveway with the same familiar gait, one that had always been a part of him. The worn-out jacket, the scuffed boots, his hands shoved into the pockets as he walked with that same nonchalant stride. His dark hair was slightly damp, falling just over his brow in that way it always did when he was in a hurry. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. My eyes were glued to him as if I were watching some strange, impossible dream unfold. My heart began to beat faster, my head spinning with disbelief. Jason was dead. He had been for 3 years. The crash had come out of nowhere. One moment he was at the bar with a group of friends, laughing and joking as he always did, and the next, his life had been ripped away in an instant. The car had veered off the road, crashing into a tree on that old country highway. It was quick, brutal, and final. There was no chance to say goodbye, no chance to make sense of it. I remembered the funeral vividly, standing at the edge of the grave, the rain falling gently around us, the earth being shoveled into the hole that had taken my friend, Jason's parents, devastated, unable to hold themselves together. I could still hear the muffled sobs of his mother as she clung to his father's arm, both of them too broken to speak. I had felt a cold emptiness during the ceremony, the kind that comes with the finality of death, and then, when it was all over, I had gone home, curled up in the dark and let the silence consume me. But now, there he was, walking up the driveway as though nothing had changed. I rubbed my eyes, hoping it was a trick of the light, a fleeting image, maybe some trick of my exhausted mind playing games with me. But no, when I opened them again, he was still there. Jason, my neighbor, walking up to his house, turning the doorknob, and disappearing inside as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't move, I couldn't think. My body was frozen in place, my fingers curled around the windowsill as if they were the only thing keeping me grounded to reality. But reality seemed like a distant concept now, something out of my reach. How could this be happening? How could he be alive? I stumbled away from the window, my heart racing in my chest. My thoughts were a jumble of confusion and fear. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was losing my mind. I had been under a lot of stress lately. Work had been overwhelming, the pressure mounted with each passing day. Maybe this was just a culmination of weeks of sleepless nights, of too much coffee and too little rest. But no, this wasn't just a figment of my imagination. This was real. I rushed to the door, throwing it open as the storm whipped around me. The rain hit my face like needles, but I barely noticed. My focus was solely on the house across the street, the house that Jason had lived in, the house where he had just walked inside. I had to know. I had to confirm that what I saw wasn't some bizarre hallucination. The closer I got to his house, the more the world seemed to war. The rain seemed louder, the wind stronger, as though nature itself was reacting to the bizarre reality I was being forced to face. I stood across the street, staring at his front door, the familiar red brick of his house now seeming strangely alien. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, my eyes fixed on that door, but it felt like hours. Every second stretched out, drawn in by the tension building. Inside me, I could feel the storm pressing down on me, the weight of something far larger than I could comprehend hanging in the air. Was this a glitch? Was time itself warping, shifting in a way I couldn't understand? I remember remembered the books I'd read, the conspiracy theories about time loops, alternate realities, and parallel universes. But those had always seemed like stories, fiction, nothing real, nothing that could affect me. But here I was, staring at a man I knew had been dead for 3 years, watching him walk into his house as though he had never left. I turned back toward my own house, my legs weak beneath me, my mind still grappling with what had just happened. I walked inside, shutting the door behind me with a trembling hand. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It felt as though the entire world had tilted on its axis, and I was the only one left standing in the chaos. I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing. I couldn't be the only one who had seen this, right? Someone else had to have noticed the strange anomaly, the impossible sight that had just played out before me. But when I tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation, nothing seemed to fit. Could it be a mistake? Was there some simple explanation, some trick of the mind that caused me to see what I had? But no, deep down I knew it wasn't a mistake. It had been Jason, had seen it, and that thought alone sent a wave of terror through me. What did it mean? What was happening to reality? The next morning arrived quietly, a fragile stillness settling over the town. The storm had passed, leaving behind the remnants of its fury. A sky washed out to a muted gray, the ground slick and shimmering with puddles that reflected the pale light of the overcast day. The sense of foreboding that had clung to the night still hung heavy in the air, making it difficult to shake the unsettling events of the previous evening. Jason, my dead neighbor, had come back to life, or at least he had appeared to. I hadn't slept a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of him walking up the driveway, unlocking his door, and vanishing inside played on an endless loop in my mind. I couldn't escape it, couldn't make sense of it. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was impossible, that there had to be some reasonable explanation, some mistake, some trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me. But the more I thought about it, the less those explanations seemed to hold water. I had to find answers. I had to know what was going on, or I was going to lose my mind. By noon, I could no longer stand the weight of confusion and fear pressing down on me. I needed to speak to someone who might know something, anyone who could help me make sense of what had happened. But where to begin? I walked across the street, my legs heavy with the burden of uncertainty. The house Jason had lived in stood like an unassuming monument to the past, its red brick facade unchanged, its windows reflecting the dull sky above. It looked normal, too normal. That's what made it all the more eerie. How could everything appear so ordinary when I knew deep in my bones that something was horribly wrong? I reached the door and hesitated for a moment. Should I knock? What would I even say? Hi, I saw your son, the one who died 3 years ago, walking into his house last night. Any chance you know what's going on? I shook my head, the thought absurd even in my own mind. No, it wasn't the parents I needed to talk to. Not yet, at least. There had to be someone else who could help. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Calloway, came to mind. She was older, an eccentric woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, always full of strange anecdotes about the town's past. If anyone knew something unusual about this place, it would be her. I knocked on her door, the sound echoing in the quiet street. There was a long pause before the door creaked open. Mrs. Calloway appeared in the doorway, her gray hair tied back in a loose bun, her thick glasses pursed on the edge of her nose. Hello, dear, she said, her voice raspy but warm. What brings you over this way? Hi, Mrs. Calloway, I replied, trying to sound casual, though I felt anything but. I was hoping you might know something. I mean, do you remember Jason, my neighbor? He passed away 3 years ago, right? She raised an eyebrow, adjusting her glasses. Of course, I remember. Such a tragedy, that one. The car accident, wasn't it? Yeah, I said, my voice shaking slightly. Well, last night I saw him. He was walking up the driveway like he never left. I don't know what to make of it. I can't stop thinking about it. Her eyes narrowed as she studied me, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more serious. You saw him, you say? I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. I know it sounds crazy. I just don't know what to think. Am I losing my mind? Mrs. Calloway stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, dear, and sit down. I followed her into the dimly lit living room, the smell of old books and incense hanging in the air. The house was cluttered, every surface covered with mementos, pictures, and trinkets. Mrs. Calloway took a seat in a worn armchair by the window, and I sat across from her, my legs restless as I waited for her to speak. She stared at me for a long time, her eyes piercing through me as if she were reading something I didn't want her to see. Finally, she spoke. I've seen things, too, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Things that didn't make sense, things that shouldn't have happened. This town, it's different. There are forces here, things we don't fully understand. I leaned forward, my heart thudding in my chest. What do you mean? What kind of forces? Mrs. Calloway sighed, her eyes distant as if she were remembering something long buried. This town has a way of holding on to its past. There are stories, old stories, people who lived here before us, people who should have left long ago. They didn't, and now their presence lingers. Sometimes the boundaries between the past and the present blur. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Was she talking about ghosts? About some supernatural explanation? It didn't sound like something I could easily dismissed, but it didn't sound like something I could accept either. Still, I couldn't shake the image of Jason, his face, his walk, the way he had opened that door, like he had never left. Maybe Mrs. Calloway was onto something. Do you think it could be something like that? A ghost? She shook her head slowly, her fingers twitching nervously in her lap. No, not exactly. Not a ghost, but something like that. Something that bends time, makes it stretch and twist in ways we don't understand. There are places in this town and times that are broken. I didn't know what to say to that. The rational part of my mind screamed that this was all madness, superstitions, and delusions. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The world had always felt off-kilter here. There had been strange occurrences, odd coincidences that no one seemed to talk about, but they lingered in the air like an unspoken truth. What can I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Calloway smiled softly, though her eyes were filled with sorrow. I don't know if you can do anything, dear. Some things are beyond us, but you can try to understand what's happening. If you're brave enough, maybe you can fix it. But be careful. Some doors, once open, can never be closed again. Her words hung in the air like a warning, heavy with a sense of impending doom. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her gaze on me as I walked toward the door. I'll keep that in mind, I said, though I wasn't sure what it meant. As I stepped back onto the porch, the air seemed colder, the sky dark. The storm from the night before had passed, but a different kind of storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was shifting, something was wrong. I walked back across the street, my steps slow and deliberate. I couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Calloway's words. Was there really something broken in this town, some unseen force that was warping reality itself? And if so, what did that mean for me, for Jason, for everyone who had ever called this place home? The thought that Jason had come back, that somehow he was walking among us again, felt like the beginning of something far darker, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But one thing was certain, I couldn't turn away from it, not now. I had to know the truth, even if it meant unraveling everything I had ever believed. As I approached my house, I glanced across the street again, my eyes instinctively drawn to the front door of Jason's house. It stood there, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better now. Something had happened. Something was happening, and I wasn't going to stop until I figured out what it was. I hadn't planned to go back to Jason's house, not after everything that had happened. It was crazy, right? To think that I could just walk across the street and find some explanation, some closure, after seeing something that defied every logical explanation I had ever known. But Mrs. Calloway's words echoed in my mind. Some doors, once open, can never be closed again. She hadn't meant literal doors, of course. No, she had been talking about the metaphysical doors, the ones we step through when we let ourselves explore the impossible. And as much as I hated to admit it, I had already crossed that threshold. Once you see something, you can't unsee it. Once you start down a path, you can't go back. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't live with the uncertainty, the nagging thought that there were answers just beyond my reach, hidden in plain sight. So against my better judgment, I found myself standing in front of Jason's door once again. The house was still just as it had always been, nothing unusual about it. The red brick, the neat hedges, the window that overlooked the street. But there was a feeling about it now, a subtle unease that hung beneath the surface, like a faint static noise just out of range of my hearing. I felt like I was trespassing, like something was watching, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I didn't know what I expected to find inside. Maybe I thought I'd see some sort of residual energy, a sign that Jason's presence had left a mark. Maybe I thought I would find clues that would explain the impossible. But what I found inside was not what I expected, not by a long shot. I knocked first, then waited, but no one answered. The door was locked as expected. Jason had been dead for years after all. His parents were the last to live here, but they had moved out not long after the funeral, unable to stay in the house after the tragedy. But now, standing here, it felt like Jason had never really left. I tried the door handle, half expecting it to be locked. When I turned it, it gave. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the darkened hallway beyond. Should I really be doing this? What was I hoping to find? But something deep inside me urged me forward, so I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking underfoot as I moved. The air inside felt stale, heavy, like a place long abandoned. There was dust on the surfaces, cobwebs in the corners, but there was something else too. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps it had been waiting for me. I walked into familiar rooms, each one exactly as it had been the last time I saw them. Nothing had changed. The kitchen was where Jason's mother used to stand, preparing dinner while he sat at a table, making light conversation. The living room with the same faded couch where Jason had collapsed after a long day, his shoes scattered across the floor. His bedroom, though it was locked, I could still see the faint outline of a childhood poster through the cracks, the same one that had been there for years. But in the back of my mind, I kept hearing the voice of Mrs. Calloway again. Some things are beyond us. Some things can't be explained. I wandered deeper into the house, my footsteps echoing against the walls as I moved toward the basement door. It stood at the end of the narrow hallway, its wooden surface chipped and worn with age. The basement had always been a place of mystery, an area Jason had refused to discuss whenever I asked about it. He had told me once that it was just full of old junk, stuff his parents didn't know what to do with. But in the months leading up to his death, he had become strangely fixated on the basement. He would spend hours down there, even after dark, doing who knows what. I never pressed him on it. I assumed it was just his way of coping with the loss of his brother, who had passed away years earlier. Now, standing in front of that door, I could feel the unease creeping back into my body, a tightening in my chest. What if I found something I wasn't meant to see? What if, by opening that door, I would stumble across something that would ruin everything? But it was too late. The question wasn't whether I should open the door. It was whether I had the courage to. I reached for the handle, feeling a jolt of cold electricity as my fingers brushed against the brass. The door opened with a slow groan, the hinges protesting as I stepped inside. The basement was shrouded in shadows, the dim light from the cracked window at the top of the stairs barely illuminating the space. The air was thick and musty, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. I could see boxes piled high, dusty furniture covered in old sheets, and forgotten mementos of a life that had been left behind. But there, tucked away in the corner, was something that made my heart stop. A large mirror. I didn't remember it being there before. Not like this. It stood alone, framed in dark wood, its surface gleaming in the dim light. I didn't know what it was doing there, or why it was so out of place in a basement full of old junk, but it felt wrong. It was as if it didn't belong. I slowly approached it, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the glass. The reflection that greeted me wasn't mine, at least not entirely. It was a distorted version of me, a warped, shadowy figure that barely resembled my own form. I blinked, confused, but when I looked again, the figure was gone, replaced by my own reflection. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. Get a grip, I whispered to myself, but then something shifted. The air grew colder, heavier, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, as if they were alive, reaching toward me. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something far more ancient than I could comprehend. The feeling was suffocating, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on me. I turned away from the mirror, my body suddenly filled with a sense of urgency. I needed to leave, to get out of this house before it swallowed me whole. But as I turned toward the stairs, I saw him, Jason. He was standing at the foot of the staircase, his figure half shrouded in shadow. I couldn't breathe. My eyes locked on him, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there he was, staring at me with those familiar brown eyes, his face unchanged, the same tired expression he always wore when he was deep in thought. Jason? I choked out, my voice trembling. Is it really you? He didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me, his lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. It was like he was stuck in some silent moment, a ghost frozen in time. My legs moved before I could stop him, but I didn't get far. As I tried to approach him, a sudden intense force pulled me back, like a gust of wind or something else slamming into me. I stumbled and fell to the floor, my hands scraping against the cold concrete. When I looked up again, Jason was gone. Gone. The air in the basement grew thick and oppressive. The light from the cracked window seemed to fade, and I was left in the darkness, alone. Something was terribly wrong. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and I wasn't sure I could live with the consequences. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. After what I had seen in Jason's basement, my mind was spinning, lost in a labyrinth of confusion and terror. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The image of him, Jason, standing in that darkened hallway, his face unchanged, his eyes staring at me with that eerie, unblinking gaze, haunted me. It was as though something had broken open inside me, a door to a world I wasn't ready to enter. The questions kept coming. I couldn't stop myself from asking them, even though I feared the answers. What was happening to Jason? Was he even Jason anymore? Or was it something else? Something pretending to be him, a manifestation of some darker force? And the most terrifying question of all, why was I the one witnessing all of this? I spent the entire night sitting in my living room with the lights dim low, trying to process everything I had learned. The mirror in the basement had been the tipping point. When I looked into it, my reflection had been distorted, more beyond recognition. That wasn't just a trick of the light. I had felt something cold and unnatural. And then Jason had appeared. Not the way you'd expect someone to show up after years of being dead, but as a shadow, a specter caught between the past and present, trapped in some place I couldn't understand. The darkness outside pressed in against my windows, and I felt the weight of it. The storm had returned, or perhaps it had never left. The rain fell in sheets, rattling against the panes like 1,000 tiny hammers. The sound was deafening, but in the silence of my house, it was the only thing that felt familiar, the only thing that made any sense. The morning came slowly, reluctant to chase away the shadows of the night. When I finally allowed myself to close my eyes, I slept fitfully. Every dream was filled with distorted images. Jason's face, contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. A shifting landscape of memories and fears. I woke up exhausted, drained, unable to shake the feeling that I was losing myself. I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in this endless spiral of confusion. I needed to find answers, even if it meant confronting something far beyond my understanding. I couldn't go back to Mrs. Calloway. She had already told me what she knew, or at least what she was willing to share. The truth she had hinted at was too much for me to grasp, and I wasn't sure I could face it again. No, I needed to find my own answers in my own way. That meant returning to Jason's house. The house seemed to be calling me, pulling me in. Every day I found myself walking past it, my gaze drifting toward the darkened windows. The same uneasy feeling would flood through me and I would shake it off. But today, there was no avoiding it. Today, I had to go back. I didn't know why, but I had to. When I arrived at his house, the front door stood ajar, just slightly. It was as though it had been waiting for me. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The air was thick with a feeling I couldn't place. Something I stepped inside and the house felt colder than it had before. The familiar scent of dust and old wood was still there. There was something else now, something metallic like blood or rust. I followed the same path to the house, walking past the rooms I had known so well. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway that led to the basement. But when I reached the stairs that led down into the basement, I froze. The door was wide open. I hadn't opened it, I was sure of it. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached. My breath shallow, the taste of fear sharp in my mouth. Something was waiting for me down there. I could feel it. The basement was darker than before, as though the shadows had thickened overnight. The air was oppressive, heavy with the weight of years of secrets. I could barely make out the shape of the mirror in the corner, its frame barely visible in the dim light. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward it, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. When I stood before the mirror, my reflection was unchanged. But behind me, in the darkened corner of the room, I saw a figure. Jason. He was standing there as he had before, his eyes fixed on me, his mouth moving as though he were speaking, but no sound came. His lips were moving, but all I heard was a dull hum, like a buzzing in my ears. I couldn't tear my gaze away. My heart hammered in my chest and my legs trembled beneath me. Jason, I whispered, my voice barely audible. What's going on? Where have you been? But Jason didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the mirror, his hand reaching out to touch the glass. The surface rippled, distorting his image, and for the first time I saw it. A crack running through the glass, jagged and unnatural, like the mirror itself was split apart. My breath caught in my throat as the crack widened, and suddenly the reflection of Jason began to distort, his face twisting into something grotesque, something alien. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this a trick? Was this some kind of hallucination? No, this was real. Jason was real. But the version of him I was seeing now wasn't the man I had known. It was something else, something darker, something wrong. I ran, not thinking, not caring about the danger, just needing to escape. I rushed up the stairs and out the front door, slamming it behind me as I collapsed on the porch, gasping for breath. My mind was a blur of images. Jason, the mirror, the crack, the twisting, contorting figure in the glass. But then, through the fog of my panic, I heard something. A voice, a whisper, soft and chilling, carried on the wind. You shouldn't have come back. I froze. The voice was too familiar. It was Jason's. I turned around, but the street was empty. No one was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I had crossed into something I couldn't understand. The boundaries between the past and present had been blurred, and I didn't know how to undo it. Whatever was happening, whatever Jason had become, it wasn't something I could fix. The reality I had once known was unraveling, and I was falling deeper into the unknown, unable to stop myself. There was no turning back now. The darkness consumed me. One moment, I was standing before the mirror, reaching out to touch the cold surface, and the next, everything around me fractured. The world twisted in on itself like a great storm, tearing at the very fabric of reality. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The weight of something vast and incomprehensible pressed down on me, and I was drowning in it. The air, thick with static and cold, felt like it was pulling me in, deeper and deeper, into a place where the laws of time and space no longer applied. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came. My body felt weightless, like I was suspended in some otherworldly void, lost to the chaos of existence itself. Then suddenly, everything stopped. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, and the world around me froze. I gasped for air, my lungs burning as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The mirror was gone, replaced by a void, a darkness so complete that it seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight, and in the distance, I could hear the faintest whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't know the voice was real, or if it was something in my head, but it felt too real. The words were like cold fingers brushing against my spine. The voice sounded like Jason's, yet it was wrong, twisted, distorted, as though it had been ripped from him. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, anchored to the spot. My eyes darted around, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the blackness, walking slowly towards me. At first, I couldn't tell who it was, but as it came closer, I recognized the familiar features. It was Jason. At least it looked like him. But the figure that stood before me wasn't the friend I had once known. His face was twisted, grotesque, his eyes empty and hollow, as though something had stolen his soul. He smiled, but it wasn't a warm, familiar smile I remembered. It was a twisted, inhuman grin, a mocking caricature of the person he had been. "Jason?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What happened to you?" His lips parted, but the words that came out were not his own. They were distorted, warped by something dark and malevolent that had taken hold of him. "I am not Jason anymore," the voice said, its tone unnatural, hollow. "I am what remains, what they left behind." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Jason wasn't just dead. He had been taken, corrupted by something far worse than death. What I had seen in the mirror, the distorted image of Jason, was not just a trick of the mind. It was a glimpse into something darker, something beyond the veil of death and time. But what had done this to him? What force had pulled Jason into this realm, into this twisted, fractured version of reality? And why had it decided to show itself to me? As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, Jason's form began to flicker, like a glitch in the fabric of space. He was no longer a solid being, but a shifting mass of light and shadow, warping in and out of existence. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The void around me seemed to contract, pulling tighter and tighter, as if it were closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air felt like it was being sucked out of my lungs, and my heart pounded in my chest. The shadows shifted, twisting, distorting, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I was no longer in control of my own fate. fate. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices, some familiar, some not, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The world around me was breaking apart, fracturing into pieces. The ground beneath me began to crumble, and I felt myself falling, sinking into the abyss. But just as I thought I would be lost forever, I heard another voice. This one was different. It was clear, sharp, and filled with purpose. It cut through the chaos, slicing through the veil of confusion that had overtaken me. "You've crossed too far." The voice was not Jason's. It wasn't the distorted whisper of whatever dark force had claimed him. It was something else entirely. Someone else. A figure appeared before me, but it was not human, at least not entirely. The figure was shrouded in light, its features obscure, but there was a sense of ancient power radiating from it, as if it were a force that had existed long before time itself. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and yet it held a strange, comforting calm. "You were never meant to see this." The voice spoke again, but this time it was not threatening. It was a warning, a plea. I struggled to understand, but the words were too much for me to grasp. My mind was reeling, caught between fear and confusion. This force, whatever it was, had been watching me. It knew me. It knew everything about me. "This is not your fight," the voice continued, softer now. "You must leave before it consumes you." The figure reached out, and I felt an overwhelming pull, as if the very fabric of reality was reaching for me, trying to draw me away from the dark abyss that had threatened to swallow me. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, trapped in a dimension that didn't belong to me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to break free, but the force around me was too strong. My vision blurred, and the world around me began to collapse, the darkness closing in, taking everything with it. And then, just as suddenly as it all started, everything stopped. The world returned to normal. I was back in the basement, standing before the mirror. The crack was gone. The room was still. The silence was deafening. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breath shallow. The storm had stopped. The house was still. Everything was still. I felt my knees go weak. I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor. I had no idea what had just happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? Had I really crossed into that other world? Or had it all been an illusion? I didn't know. I couldn't know. But one thing was certain. I couldn't go back. Whatever force had claimed Jason, whatever had warped the very fabric of time and reality, was still out there, and I had seen it. I had been part of it. I stumbled out of the basement, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had learned. The truth was too much to bear, but I couldn't forget it. It would follow me, haunt me, until I could find a way to break the cycle. But for now, all I could do was leave. Leave before it all consumed me. The end.